use an ultrafiltrate of the plasma. It's got a little bit different ion concentrations, protein and glucose than the plasma, but it's very similar, and it literally, as I said, helps to support the brain and float the brain. This is an example of a patient who had hydrocephalus and was eventually treated by putting a shunt in the brain that drained some of that CSF into the thoracic cavity where it could be resorbed. So this is after treatment. The individual is still obviously disfigured, but it's much better than it was. Whereas an individual who's an adult is going to potentially be killed by that condition. So this shows where the sutures are. If you've ever held a baby, you've probably noticed the fontanelles, which are located in the front as well as the rear. So you have the frontal fontanelle as well as the occipital fontanelle and the various different sutures, which I said actually are going to fuse at different times. So some of them fuse relatively early after the individual becomes an adult. Others fuse typically ages 30 and 40 years old, but some may even go as late as the late 50s in some individuals. All right, so the cerebral spinal fluid is produced, as I said, by the choroid plexus. It fills the subarachnoid space and the ventricles. It's literally a fluid pillow that the brain floats in. It's an ultrafiltrate of blood, and you can see that it provides several of these functions. It protects against acute changes in arterial and venous blood pressure. It also functions as a route of waste excretion, and they've done studies where when an individual sleeps, the CSF literally washes through the brain and helps to get rid of any potential toxins, because they used to think that the brain didn't have a lymphatic system, but the more they started looking for it, and when they started doing careful dissection, they found that in fact the brain does have a lymphatic system. And we'll see that later on, the lymphatic system in the rest of the body helps to take excess fluid and to put it back into the vascular system. So the CSF is one of the routes of waste excretion, and in times of sleep, it helps to do that function. So the comparison, the proteins, calcium, glucose, as well as other ion concentrations, you can see are similar but not the same as that found in plasma. When a physician does a spinal tap, they typically do the spinal tap in the lumbar region, and they look, there's an opening pressure. When a patient has meningitis, that pressure increases. It's normally has a straw-colored appearance, so it's similar to that of plasma. When a patient has meningitis, it can be cloudy from the presence of bacteria. You can also have increased number of white cells, particularly neutrophils in the case of bacterial meningitis, or lymphocytes in the case of viral meningitis. So different concentrations of protein and glucose. You can look for the presence of immunoglobulins, which may indicate that a patient could have some type of leukemia or lymphoma, and you also look at the types of cells as well as if there are any bacteria. The hospitals typically do culture and sensitivity to be able to put the patient on the antibiotic that's going to be able to treat that bacterial infection. So the CSF, normally clear and colorless, but you can have blood cells in it. In certain cases, if a patient has an aneurysm in the brain, an aneurysm is an outpouching of one of the arteries, and it's an area of weakness. If that ruptures, you can literally die from it in what's known as a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and the blood goes into that subarachnoid space, which happens to be where the CSF is. So if you see bright red blood in the CSF and the patient came in with the worst headache of their life, that's an indication that that individual may have had a subarachnoid hemorrhage or that the aneurysm is leaking. And in one case, a medical school professor was giving a lecture, and all of a sudden he developed a severe headache, and he told the class, "I think I'm having a subarachnoid hemorrhage," and he promptly fell over and dropped dead. And unfortunately, he was correct. He made his own diagnosis, but he didn't live to see the scan. So it can also appear yellow, which physicians don't say is yellow, they say it's xanthochromic, and that tends to be from the presence of bilirubin, which is a breakdown product of hemoglobin. So the cell counts, you don't have to know these, but based on the cell count, particularly if they're neutrophils, as I said, that indicates a bacterial infection. If it's lymphocytes, that could be a viral infection. You can also have certain types of plasma cells, which are a feature of TB, which is tuberculosis, meningitis. So there are all sorts of different things that can cause problems with the cerebrospinal fluid and the alteration of the cells that are present there. So this actually shows in this diagram, this region in blue is not the cerebrospinal fluid. That's actually venous blood, and that's the central venous sinus. And the cerebrospinal fluid is actually right in here. You can see these arrows where the CSF literally is on the outside of the brain, and it's in this arachnoid granulations where the CSF is in the subarachnoid space, where you get the CSF being resorbed into the venous blood via those arachnoid villi or granulations. Remember, the CSF is produced in the choroid plexus, and what that is you have the capillaries in the brain, and you have not tight junctions as you do in the blood-brain barrier, but the fluid gets out and they go through tight junctions in these glial cells known as ependymal cells. So the blood CSF barrier actually consists of the tight junctions in these ependymal cells, and it's between the blood in the capillaries and the cerebrospinal fluid. And we'll see that the blood-brain barrier is actually located between the capillaries in the brain and the brain tissue itself. So the blood comes out of the capillaries and then it goes through the phospholipid bilayer of the cells in the capillaries, which have tight junctions, and it then goes into the interstitial fluid, which is the fluid between the neurons in the brain. All right, so this shows the vascular network. The brain gets its blood supply via the carotid arteries, which split into the internal and external carotids. The blood then drains via the jugular vein, not the jugular vein, the jugular vein. So that, and the venous blood literally collects in the venous sinuses, which we'll see a better diagram of coming up. This region, which right here is known as the Circle of Willis, where you see an extended version of it on this side. So this region is very critical for neuroanatomists, because if you have a problem there, either an aneurysm or something gets injured, that can literally be what's called a watershed area in the brain, where if you get an injury or have a stroke there, it can literally take out one whole side of the brain, because as you see, we'll see in another diagram that those blood vessels can supply one whole hemisphere. And this is what it shows or looks like in life. These are the optic nerves. This is the optic chiasm. This is the Circle of Willis right here. So in certain cases, if you get a bulging that comes out from the Circle of Willis, it may or may not affect the individual's vision. We'll see other tumors, for instance, in the pituitary are also located near that optic chiasm, so you can get various different changes in vision from those pituitary tumors as well. And as we saw in the endocrine system, the pituitary is very important for producing many hormones. The anterior pituitary, remember, produces growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, the gonadotropins, prolactin, all of those are produced there. All right, so this shows like coming off the circle of Willis, for instance, if you had a problem here, it would literally take out this entire hemisphere. So the brain neuroanatomy is very important for supplying, like these are perforator arteries that go into specific regions of the brain, and certain regions of the brain are literally more important than others. You can have a stroke in one small area of the brain that can literally cause you to go become totally paralyzed. You're still conscious, you can know what's going on, and the only thing that you can literally move are your eyes. And in many cases, they weren't aware that patients were conscious and they thought they were in comas. But if you ever read the novel, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, which they made a movie of, one of the caregivers for one of these patients was able to identify through the eye movements that that patient was conscious. And they were able to develop a system where the caregiver went over the alphabet, and every time they were able to, the patient was able to pick a letter, so that he literally dictated a book over the course of time, like 6 months, and they wrote that book, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. So the brain has been studied, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years, because of an initiative called the Brain Initiative that was funded by Obama. Previously, they were studying the brain mostly from injuries that patients had received. They also do studies like functional MRI and PET scanning that look at the activity of certain regions of the brain and how those areas take up glucose when the individual is doing things like math problems or other activities, so that they can tell which regions of the brain are important for specific functions. And they've identified regions that are specific for taste, memory, like the hippocampus and the amygdala are notorious for assisting in memory, but they've also found the gustatory region, which is for taste, olfactory region, which is for smell. There's also Broca's area and Wernicke's area for processing language and being able to interpret spoken language as well as written language. So this shows the route of blood within the brain. So you literally have 2 hemispheres of the brain which are separated by structure and attached by the corpus callosum. And we'll see that if you disrupt that corpus callosum, one side of the brain literally won't know what the other is thinking about. And they've developed interesting experiments where, because of the way vision works, like your left field of vision is going to totally be processed by the right side of your brain, and vice versa. Your right field of vision is processed by the left side of the brain, specifically in the occipital cortex. And when they severed the corpus callosum, and they did that because certain patients had epileptic seizures in one area of the brain, and to prevent it from becoming totally going over to the other side, they did those surgeries to try to limit the epileptic seizures. And there are a number of interesting experiments that were done that, like having the patient feel a ball with one hand and trying to describe what they're picking up, and they can describe it, but they can't identify it by a picture. There's all sorts of interesting experiments that go on. This shows the route of blood within the brain, and remember, the blood-brain barrier is actually the barrier between the capillaries that are supplying those brain cells with oxygen and glucose, and the brain is one of the biggest hogs of glucose in the body because the neurons are particularly ravenous for needing glucose, and certain areas of the brain absolutely require glucose for them to be able to function. All right, so this shows the meninges. The dura mater has been resected. These are some of the bridging veins in blue, and in certain cases, particularly with elderly individuals, if they have a head injury, like if they're in an automobile accident, these bridging veins can rupture and they can start losing blood. And that's going to give you what's called a subdural hematoma, where the blood starts collecting underneath the dura, and it can literally push the brain out of the way and potentially cause brain herniation. And a number of elderly individuals, oftentimes they get in an automobile accident, they have a head injury, they feel fine afterwards. In the evening, they start feeling sleepy, they go to bed, and they don't end up waking up because that subdural hematoma is going to keep growing, and it may cause the brain to herniate, which is the portion of the brain, particularly the brainstem, coming out through that small hole at the bottom of the skull called the foramen magnum. This shows some of those bridging veins, and the bridging veins typically drain into the central venous sinus. You can see more veins over here, and we'll see the drainage pattern of the brain. You have that central venous sinus as well as lower venous sinuses that eventually are going to drain into the jugular vein, which we see here. So that's the superior sagittal sinus. Here is the transverse sinus. That's the internal jugular vein. So those veins are getting the blood after they've come out of the capillaries, and it then returns it to the venous system so it can be reoxygenated. And this shows the bottom of the skull. The foramen magnum is located about here. This is the where the